misinformed so that we don't know what's happening, so that we don't give them the support that they need. And then also too, so we can't learn from them. Like, look what they created through self-determination, through direct action, through autonomy, by not allowing the state to hold a monopoly on violence. They created their own world. And if we look at that as a possibility behind in a concentration camp known as a prison industrial complex, guess what the fuck we can do out here? And that's a dangerous message for us to take. And that's why the state seizes the narrative and misinforms us constantly. But the contradictions are becoming too high in our times, where it is not like when it will happen, is that it's already happening. And what are we going to do? Are we going to stand with the people? Or are we going to align with the state? And then what does that look like? I'll get back to reading. The state's characterization of the rebellion as a dictatorial regime contrasts sharply with the recollections of many who were intimately familiar with its inner dynamics. Spokesmen were selected based on their respect within the population and appointed through a consensual process. According to Chapin, time constraints often force a spokesman to make unilateral decisions. However, he maintained that he and others were elected because the masses trusted them to make these decisions, and that they always informed the commune of such decisions after the fact. Moreover, when faced with major decisions such as those involving the content of their written demands, the spokesman communicated the issue to the commune and opened the floor for debate. In these instances, anyone who wanted to have a voice in the decision-making process needed only to approach the negotiating table, ask for the microphone, and address the yard. This included those who did not speak English, as young Lord and Arburn ringleader Dalu Gonzalez remained on hand to perform Spanish translation. When debates arose, decisions were reached by simple majority, as indicated by the volume of applause issued in favor of a given course of action. Multiple outside observers would later refer to D.R. not as a dictatorship, but as a true democracy. In a document written to the surviving Attica brothers in 1973, and real quick. So the fact that, again, these institutions put out a report and describing it as a dictatorship, and those who collaborated with the institution also described it as that, right? And then the people themselves who actually lived it are saying, no, this was true democracy. That should tell you all you need to know about what you're currently living in today. Because you ask those same collaborators, you ask the same people aligning with the state and institution, what they describe what we live in now, they'll tell us that this is democracy, that this is freedom. That should let you know all you need to know about where we're at. And the song that I played from Dead Prez in the beginning, like, you don't got to be locked up to be in prison. Like, look how they treat us. Like, they keep us in a box, just like our life on the block. If we start looking at this thing as more as just like, oh, this is just how things are, and instead of continuation of the apocalypse of settler colonialism, which is what this is, a lot more things would become very increasingly clear of what needs to be done. In a document written to the surviving Attica brothers in 1973, Jomo Amawale took exception to the media portrayal of the Attica spokesman and the security force as a coercive apparatus, and the rendering of the commune's majority as, quote unquote, zombies and fools who only move when they're told, who can't think of their own selves. Ooh, the irony. At the time, over 60 of them, including Jomo, were facing charges for their role in the rebellion, and the core function of the trial, as Jomo saw it, was to criminalize Black resistance, to portray the rebels as warmongers, and to demonstrate that an autonomous social order established by Black convicts and revolutionaries could not possibly be more just or egalitarian than capitalist democracy. Talk that shit, Jomo. That's exactly what the fuck it is. He argued that this had to do with the authoritarianism and violence inherent in Western democracy. It is difficult for people who are familiar with the dictatorship form of government to accept the fact that a group of a couple hundred people could decide things or move on things in a collective or democratic manner. He argues that security was not an instrument of coercion, but rather a means of preserving the integrity of the commune and the well-being of each of its members. This next part is going to be a part of his letter. Security was mainly responsible for the food, medical care, clothing, what have you, to keep people from getting ripped off sexually or keep the water supply, to see that everyone have mattresses, blankets at night, mainly that everybody stay together and recognize one another as brothers under the same roof, same conditions, being able to look above the 11,000 of inch difference, such as when, oh wait, I read that wrong. Hold on. Being able to look above the 1/1000th of an inch difference, such as skin, not to get hung up in the racial thing and not to let it grow into a racial riot. This is one of the main things we try to prevent. Through security, the commune protected itself from regressing back toward the culture of exploitation, racism, and automation that defined the normalized carceral regime. However, the DR commune was not a utopian zone free of contradiction, conflict, or coercion. When I asked an Attica survivor if it was true that otherwise unwilling captives were herded into DR and prevented from leaving, he said, "Let me put it to you like this. Everybody was down, or everybody wasn't down. Others represented a counterinsurgent element from within." In 1972, Thomas Hughes published a acerbic essay in the Conservative National Review under the pseudonym Frederick Wiggins. He argued that the rebellion was orchestrated by a small band of communist, anti-white fanatics who did not speak for the more rational element of the inmate population. Yo, I want that on my fucking tombstone. Put me as a communist, anti-white fanatic. On September, I'm just kidding. I'm going to get burned anyways. On September 10th, a small group of white captives was ordered to dig the commune's latrine as punishment for flying a white flag above their tent, an apparent signal to the state that they were on the side of the enemy. Later that day, two white men, Barry Schwartz and Kenneth Hess, were observed giving an unauthorized interview to a reporter who had been allowed into the yard. A tribunal was held in which the pair were found guilty of treason and incarcerated in what the rebels called the People's Prison. Michael Piravera, I'm messing up that name, who was also white and had been suffering from a mental episode so severe that he was unable to remember who he was or control his motor functions, was also incarcerated in this prison within a prison. 3 days later, when state investigators were picking through the ruins of the commune, the bodies of Schwartz, Hess, and Piravetera were recovered from the yard. One or more of the rebels had stabbed them multiple times and slashed their throats. The incarceration and execution of these men by the rebels complicates Attica's abolitionist legacy and exposes a tension within abolitionist genealogies. Prison abolition tends to be framed as an ethical practice in which reliance on violence and carceral techniques is discarded in service of building a world without prisons. What then are we to do with the fact that the Attica rebels erected a prison within what I have already called an abolition geography and summarily executed 3 men uh, for violating an unspoken code of conduct and being difficult to manage? It is important to note that while several of the rebellion's revolutionaries identified as abolitionists, others did not. Dalu Gonzalez, a third world Marxist, once said, "I don't advocate abolishing prisons. What are we going to do with the Rockefellers and the Nixons and shit?" So this point, which I just read, is actually a point of contention in a lot of cadres and circles and popular discourse, because that is true. When people hear abolition, they think like, oh, then y'all don't believe in violence. Y'all don't believe in any kind of like punishment or anything like that. It's about centering the abuser. No, the fuck it's not. No, the fuck it's not. It means that, look, when someone is a rapist, a predator, a danger to the community and to the struggle, they got to be taken out. They got to face the wall. They got to bite the curb. Like, there's no reforming. We're not in position currently where in which we would have the power to enforce like them staying in line. So what actually happens is when these methods become about centering the predator and shit, that predator just learns the language of the oppressed and learns how to dress themselves in sheep clothing and to keep preying on people and not to be detected as easily. So they become a danger. That's why, to me, where we're at, no, we don't need to reform predators and people who prey on the most vulnerable. You take them motherfuckers the fuck out. So yeah, that does mean homophobes. That means transphobes. That means misogynists. That means people who prey on children, whether it's exploiting their labor, not respecting their autonomy, any of that. That to me is an automatic face the wall, and it shows that within revolts, not only within prisons but throughout history, that people had to take these extremes in order not to be infiltrated because it became a security risk. And then they found out that those who they gave leniency to and allowed to stay in end up becoming state actors and end up turning the people over to the state in the end. So that's what I'm saying. It's all this is security issue. So yes, we don't believe in prisons and what exists in colonial America, in which they created a network of concentration camps to suppress rebellion and to keep the masses oppressed and exploited. Of course, we don't believe in that system. That does not then mean that predators get away with shit. No, that means the motherfuckers get killed because they're actually state actors. So yes, of course, they would die along with the state. So I hope that's cleared the fuck up. So let me keep reading. I'm sorry, but that shit pisses me off because how watered down the prison abolitionist movement is in its current state pisses me off on a whole nother fucking level. And unfortunately, my people locked up are dealing with the consequences of our inaction. Dallow's provocation compels a retheorization of abolitionist ethics under battlefield conditions. His claim that prisons are necessary stem not from his investment in the state's monopoly over legitimate violence, nor in the moral validity of the prison in an abstract sense, but from his tactical calculation that in order for a besieged population to endure in the face of determined opposition, liabilities and antagonists would need to be incapacitated and neutralized. Exactly. After all, taking the guards hostage and imprisoning them have been the revolt's condition of possibility, enabling the delimited freedom that had brought them to this point. Attica was an incomplete abolition, not only because it occurred on a temporarily and geographically limited scale, but also because it necessitates other forms of captivity. Still, Attica represented something worth fighting for, and fight they did, in visible and invisible ways. This next section is called the Attica Underground. The Attica Underground. In an untitled essay in Babylon, an underground newspaper launched by the Algiers-based international section of the BPP, two key figures of the New York's radical prison movement argue that in the United States there exists an undeclared state of war. I gotta say that shit again because I need my people to feel that shit. In the United States, there exists an undeclared state of war. Like we are literally living in war. On one side, were the poor and dispossessed masses struggling to eke out an existence across the globe. On the other, where the super rich, their corporate empires, and their racist reactionary state machinery. However, a large fraction of the populace, especially those who the authors call Black reform integrationists and white liberals, were confused about the nature of their struggle and the methods needed to win. This confusion was dangerous since the people were running out of time. What was needed was for progressive political forces to accept the terms of war and transcend all constraints, all restrictions imposed upon us by the enemy. Written in December of 1971 in the Brooklyn House of Detention, this call to arms was co-authored by Dhoruba Ben Wahad, a leader in the New York chapter of the BPP, a key architect of the Black Liberation Army, and Hubert X. Blyden of the Tombs and Attica rebellions. Its authorship and analysis are indicative of the underexplored relationship between the Long Attica Revolt, the BLA, and the Black Underground more broadly. This relationship has remained largely unknown for multiple reasons. First, underground formations are inherently secretive. Second, many of Attica's revolutionaries have passed away, often violently, either during the September 13 massacre or years after the rebellion, sometimes under questionable circumstances. Third, analysts of slavery and prisons have tended to produce narratives of Black supplication, and suffering over those of Aegean and militant rebellion. Fourth, evidence of Black militancy gets pruned from historical narratives out of fear that its appearance could be used as a pretext for greater repression. By contrast, my conception of the Long Attica Revolt treats the axiom repression breeds resistance as pragmatic. Oh, I'm sorry, paradigmatic. My bad. The underground is a geographical metaphor for a condition of militant refusal and a refusal to respectability, visibility, governability, and upward mobility under racial capitalism and colonial war. This condition traverses political, cultural, economic, and spatial domains of fugitive, often illegal, confrontation with the state. When framed through the practical concerns of revolutionary warfare, the underground is a clandestine infrastructure for carrying out political military actions. These actions include financial expropriations, prison breaks, transportation of fugitives, and armed offensives against state infrastructure and personnel. The basic premise is that a liberation movement cannot succeed if it does not have an apparatus for engaging in criminalized activities, ideally, those that leave no definitive links to the above ground forms of organization it is designed to support. The BLA was not a discrete organization, but rather an umbrella term for various centralized units. Zaid Malik Shakur defined it as a solid subterranean apparatus existing here in the United States, an aligned conglomeration of many armed groups that base their credentials on action. In her opening statement during a trial for the killing of a New Jersey state trooper, Assata Shakur, perhaps the best known member of the BLA, described its origins and nature. Grab some water. She says, the idea of a Black Liberation Army emerged from conditions in Black communities, conditions of poverty, indecent housing, massive unemployment, poor medical care, and inferior education. The idea came about because Black people are not free or equal in this country, because 90% of the men and women in this country prisons are Black and third world, because 10-year-old children are shot down in our streets, because dope was saturated our community, preying on the disillusionment and frustration of our children. The concept of the BLA arose because of the political, social, and economic oppression of Black people in this country. And where there is oppression, there will be resistance. The BLA is part of that resistance movement. The Black Liberation Army stands for freedom and justice for all people. The fact that the grievances of the BLA around issues of conditions, poverty, housing, unemployment, medical care, education, freedom, equality, oppression, and state violence are virtually identical to the formal demands issued throughout the jail rebellion, the Auburn Rebellion, and Attica disrupts the dominant narrative that Attica was about reforming quote unquote poor prison conditions, and instead focuses our attention on the generalized conditions of anti-Black genocide under globalized empire. That shit hits, huh? They talking that real shit. More than receptacles for the criminalized poor, prisons were crucibles through which the BLA, as a historically specific articulation of the Black underground, was forged in blood and bone. Following the Panther 21 frame-up, Kawazi Balagoon, Doroba bin Wahad, and other New York Panthers were forced underground, organizing themselves into autonomous BLA cells. At the same time, the radicalizing effects of racist state violence combined with militant political education to create a situation in which, according to Assata Shakur, Black revolutionaries were being manufactured in droves in the ghetto streets, places like Attica, San Quentin, Bedford Hills, Leavenworth, and Sing Sing. Kareem Allah joined the BLA in Auburn, and estimates that 30 other men followed the same path, including Woody Changa Green, Anthony Kimu White, Henry Shasa Brown, James Cato Dune, and James Joshink Daniels, Morano Dalu Gonzalez, and Jomo Sekou Amawale. There were also other folks like Blyden, Akil, and many others who never officially joined, if such a thing can be said about an underground organization, but were politicized by BLA ideology and who DOCS would label BLA associates. BLA actions carried out beyond prison walls often made their connection to Attica explicit. For example, 3 months after the massacre, a BLA unit calling itself the Attica Brigade claimed responsibility for a grenade attack on the NYPD patrol car. Fucking power to the people, man. I love that shit. I got some water. Although the Black Panther begins mentioning the BLA as early as October of 1968, the public became aware of its existence in the spring of 1971. And when it claimed responsibility for killing 2 New York City patrolmen and wounding 2 more, at roughly the same moment, captains began establishing their own underground formation within Attica's walls, the so-called Central Revolutionary Format, also known as the Tactical Intelligence and Combat Unit, aimed to build an infrastructure of political radicalization and communication and military capacity that linked the militant factions of Attica's various political contingencies through a pyramid structure. Man, military minded, revolutionary minded. They coordinated. They said, "Yo, we're in an ongoing warfare, a black genocide. So we're gonna act like it." So as they engaged in guerrilla warfare in the streets and then were captive by the state, they knew their job was to not only radicalize other captives, but to create networks and link it to the underground. That is military minded. That is revolutionary minded. And that is understanding your reality. That this isn't like some hiccup. Racism and white supremacy and colonialism isn't some hiccup, some error of humanity. No, it's very intentional. And that we are in an ongoing colonial project. And that this entity will not succumb to love and pleads and begging. No, no, no. It will only succumb to an equal or greater violence. Although the Black Panther begins mentioning the BLA as, lost my place. Finally, there were network cells composed of no more than 4 brother comrades who had undergone a program of political, economic, and social cultural indoctrination, as well as the study of the military-industrial complex and guerrilla warfare. And that, when I was like younger with the old heads that was teaching me about Pan-Africanism and communism, that's how they trained us. Like they gave us a plan. We had to learn how to shoot. We had to understand guerrilla warfare. We had to understand that we were in the midst of ongoing genocide and that it was a part of the colonial project of white hegemony and dominance. So like, it's really strange to see these conversations absent from current day politics where it's like, yo, what's happening? But this is exactly where the conversation needs to be. I'll keep going. Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, Revolutionary Catechism, and the writings of Frantz Fanon and George Jackson were required reading. Exactly. The extent to which this plan for an underground formation was actually realized prior to the Attica Rebellion, the identity of its participants, and its impacts during the revolt all remain an open question. But the incubation of this clandestine political military apparatus alongside and in dialogue with the BLA significantly reshapes how we think about Attica, revealing it to be an expression of the Black underground and an articulation of a global, decolonial, abolitionist, revolutionary counter-war. Of course, not all the rebels in Attica saw the rebellion in these terms, participated in these formations, or identified with radical or revolutionary politics. Bugs represented a sizable fraction of the population that saw themselves not as revolutionaries, but as gangsters, outlaw capitalists committed to individual financial gain. Bugs approached New York City's huge market for heroin as a path to upward mobility, familial stability, and material comfort within existing capitalist social relations. When I asked him if he was down with the Panthers, he invoked a tone and rhetorical style that reflected his mindset in the early 1970s. He says, "Panther? What the fuck a Panther? Nigga, I'm a gangster. Fuck, I know about that shit. I ain't political. My politics is what I want, what's mine every day in my pocket. Shit, yeah, I know conditions is bad and we need to do better, but I'm trying to get out of here. and go home where I can do better for myself. Shit, you got 2 million dope fiends in New York buying dope every day. I'm gonna be one of the dudes that's gonna sell them some. You understand? That's my outlook. My revolution is getting me some money and moving my family to a nice house, buying me a car, dress well, and eat well, cause the rest of that shit ain't nothing. Wind up in a box somewhere with people singing over your ass talking about he challenged the power that be. And that's the end of Bugs's answer to his question. While espousing revolutionary politics might garner admiration from the people, it was also likely to result in a painful life and premature death. Interestingly, however, it was Bugs the gangster and not the revolutionary who orchestrated one of the most significant guerrilla acts during the revolt. After the explosion of the chapel, Bugs melded into the D Yard assembly, making a concerted effort to keep a low profile and avoid the spotlight, thereby evading the worst of the retaliation he knew was coming. This was key to his survival. While many of the self described revolutionaries understood the importance of situational awareness and to be anonymous, deniability, and evasion, so too did putatively apolitical gangsters like Bugs. The porous boundary between acts of outlaw capitalism and radical politics helps explain why the prison was such an effective site of Black Liberation Army recruitment. On September 13th, when the state assault force descended upon the commune, the rebels, clearly incapable of marshaling effective resistance, surrendered unequivocally. What ensued was not a battle between an underground army and the state, but a massacre, one frequently likened to the My Lai massacre of 1968, in which the U.S. military slaughtered, tortured, and raped hundreds of unarmed civilians in the, I'm so sorry, I'm going to butcher this, Quang Ngai province of South Vietnam. The weapons and forms of ammunition that state actors use to carry out their indiscriminate killings and targeted assassinations have been well documented. And I'm so glad he wrote it in that way and compared it to the massacre in the My Lai massacre, because oftentimes Black suffering and Black genocide is so minimized that people will have the audacity to say some wild shit like, when people say free Palestine, it's like, all right, well, it's also free Sudan, free the Congo. They're like, oh, that can wait. That, what you mean it could wait? What does that mean? Like, anti-Blackness is oftentimes excused by those who would take upon righteous causes like free Palestine, like any other cause, like West Papua. But when it comes to the genocide happening to Black people, of course, not just in America, but all across the global South, that is where the silence comes. That's when now we got to negotiate. But when we sit there and we say, no, this is also a genocide. This is also, dehumanization. This is also, war. You would see a lot more people act differently, talk differently. So that's how we know, by looking at the way people who are positioning themselves as revolutionaries or activists, that they're not really for liberation, is by how they move when it comes to the collective struggle of liberation. That includes, of course, Black people and people of African descent. So I love how he put that when they went in there into this Black commune that was created by the captives, creating their own world of autonomy, of self-determination, they went in there and massacred and raped those people. It was a battlefield. We're not angry enough. On September 3rd, oh, I'm sorry, I read that. I was about to read it again. However, the existing literature on Attica has either de-emphasized or actively avoided elaborating the primitive military capacities developed by the rebels. This is because doing so disrupts the narrative that Attica was a negotiation for expanded rights and privileges within the prison. Rather, it suggests that there was a powerful contingent of brothers who, like Bugs, wanted to blow the joint up, either as a pure expression of Black rage or as a method of conducting revolutionary warfare through the prison. Across the rebellion's 4 days, captives employed the limited resources at their disposal to develop defensive and offensive capabilities. I like that he puts that there too, that people were talking about blowing this shit up either for revolutionary causes or just out of Black rage. Both are fucking valid. And we got to sit with that too, that people blowing up shit, looting. Not all of them are doing it for revolutionary means. It is still valid because the state itself is illegitimate. It should not exist. So any blows to empire are blows that are all legitimate and that we should never talk down to, never give any kind of, well, we gotta be, that's not how you do it. No, fuck all that. Do all that and then some. And it still won't be a fraction of the violence that they, oppress us with. So I love how he put both that there and how both are valid. Across the rebellion's 4 days, captives employed the limited resources at their disposal to develop defensive and offensive capabilities. After seizing the prison, hundreds of rebels took objects to the badly damaged but still functioning metal shop, where they fashioned them into manner of bladed weapons, literally sharpening the tips of their spears in anticipation of drawing the enemy's blood. They constructed barricades on catwalks and in underground tunnels, some of which, according to state actors, they attempted to fortify with electrified wire. They dug a series of foxholes in a long trench that was partially lined with punji stakes, sharpened spikes, and designed to impale anyone who falls inside, a defensive method popular with the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. See, the captives understood that they were at war and the battle was upon them. So they sharpened their spears, like their ancestors on the continent had to do to resist colonialism and slavery from the funky ass Europeans. Like, it's so interesting when we think about these things and what we're actually living and what we're actually witnessing is an ongoing revolutionary struggle against empire. And they knew and understood and they prepared for it. Following the rebellion, investigators with the state police bomb squad identified several objects of interest, including hundreds of Molotov cocktails and what they described as a cannon-like device constructed of an empty oxygen cylinder affixed to a wheelbase. In the metal shop, they located an explosive device constructed from a 50-gallon drum filled with toluene, a combustible liquid. Resting on top of the drum was a football helmet, a blanket, a stick, and a clock. The device had been rigged so that when the helmet was moved, a 5-second timer would activate, after which an electric charger would flow to the toluene through. I'm sorry, I read that really weird. A 5-second timer would activate, after which an electric charge would flow to the toluene through the filament found in a broken light bulb, causing the device to explode. The bomb squad also located what they called a fully operational anti-personnel device in the northwest corner of D Yard. Likely constructed by Sam Melville, the so-called Mad Bomber. The device was comprised of a 5-gallon turpentine canister affixed to a remote firing mechanism. So basically, they made their own bombs. And there's a book that I posted, and it's called, I think it's called Urbano, Guerrilla Warfare in Urban Settings, something to that effect. If you look up if you just put it in the search, it'll have it in there. And the type of bombs they're describing, there is a diagram and a how-to on how those were constructed, and it shows you in detail in pictures. So it's called it's called Fighting in the Streets, Urban Guerrilla Warfare in an Urban Setting. And so if you type Fighting in the Streets in the search on my page, the PDF will come up, and I think it's page 30 something, where it'll show a diagram of the bombs that I just explained here or described here. Many of these munitions were inoperable, and those capable of functioning were never used. The cannon was incapable of launching projectiles. The toluene bomb was connected to an outlet that had no power. The anti-personnel device found in D Yard was fully operational but was not filled with combustible liquid. Similarly, several of the Molotov cocktails contained cottonseed oil. Others were functional but never ignited. Nevertheless, the existence of these weapons is an indication of the resourcefulness of the brothers within the yard and their marital subjectivity. The rebels were, martial subjectivity. The rebels were preparing to defend the commune from attack, not to wage an offensive campaign against their keepers. These battle preparations were not symptomatic of generalized bloodlust, but rather a militant and rational response to the conditions of domestic war. The rebels had ample opportunity to amass enemy casualties had that been their goal. Many were not averse to violence, indeed, had committed acts of violence against their own communities. Moreover, They knew from experience that they would be punished, brutalized, and or killed regardless of how they treated the hostages. However, as we have seen in the preceding chapters, these combatants curbed their powerful urges for revenge. Elected spokesman Richard X. Clarke later explained how, as soon as the rebels inverted the power relation, transforming the keepers into the kept, the guards' sense of white masculine supremacy evaporated, and in its place was terror, humility, and supplication. I could feel the vulnerability of their position, he said, or he wrote. They had treated us like animals, and now the tables were turned. Given this context of totalizing power over enemies who had shown time and time again that they had no respect for the captive's humanity, it is significant that the rebels did not exact revenge. In 1972, a BLA commune criticized Attica and specifically its NOI participants for failing to execute the hostages. Clarke responded in his book, The Brothers of Attica, that protecting the hostages was not a religious, moral, or metaphysical question, but a pragmatic and political one. Muslims know that all white men are devils, and we do not protect devils. He saw defending the hostages as a strategic necessity since if we kill them, the man will come right in. There's no point in going to the electric chair for killing a devil that can't get away. The rebels might also have found good reason for not killing the hostages in the pages of Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Though often misread as an apostle of violence, Fanon argues that while violence is necessary to achieve decolonization, it is woefully insufficient, for the legitimate desire for revenge alone cannot nurture a war of liberation. In fact, if left unchecked, reciprocal violence will only feed on itself, be exploited by opportunistic elements within the movements, and forestall the emergence of new liberated subjects. For the third world Marxists like Dalu, the martial writings of Mao Zedong offered a rationale for treating the hostages civilly. Mao advised guerrilla forces to give lenient treatment to prisoners of war in order to disorient the enemy. Grab some water. I am suggesting that although Attica had a robust underground military culture, the decision to refrain from retaliatory violence during the rebellion was grounded in revolutionary political theory and was based on a sober assessment of the field of battle. The rebels withheld violence as a tactical calculation necessary for surviving the battle with the understanding that the next battle would likely require reevaluating this necessity. We might further theorize the rebels' refusal to torture or execute the hostages as a pedagogical strategy designed to educate state actors and the world that it was possible to develop a more humane way of treating those over whom one has power, or over whom one has power. Thus, rather than satisfy their immediate desire for revenge, they engaged in almost the theatrical, boom, took me a minute, theatrical performance of benevolence toward the hostages. They built a shelter to protect them from the sun, gave them cigarettes, water, fruit, sandwiches, and coffee, and allowed them limited amounts of exercise. Following the rebellion, multiple hostages reported on their humane treatment. One of them said, when they ate hot meals, we had hot meals. When they had sandwiches, so did we. We had mattresses, but they didn't. Their performance led a journalist with the Village Voice to proclaim that the rebels should be thought of as an oppressed nation, one that was more just and less violent than the larger nation outside. Despite some criticism of their tactical nonviolence, the BLA's response to Attica was overwhelmingly supportive. In a letter to journalists and Attica observers, Tom Whitaker, Eldridge Cleaver, the rapist, called Attica the highest expression yet of the revolutionary politics the BPP and BLA helped bring into being, while BPP/BLA soldiers, Sandia Akole, called it a milestone in the development of the new African liberation struggle behind the walls and a symbol of the highest development of prisoner multinational solidarity to date. Ashanti Alston said that as bad as it was, the massacre could have been much worse and probably would have been if the brothers hadn't held back a lot of their anger. Ashanti was among the BPP BLA soldiers who helped raise funds and organize a massive funeral for slain Attica brothers in Brooklyn. Mutulu Shakur participated as well and recalls how the Attica brothers were treated as warriors killed in battle. We took the mangled and battered bodies and carried them on our shoulders, long before we became aware of such a tradition in the South African struggle. It had become a tradition at the funerals of Black Liberation Army forces. The very public organization of the Attica Commune coexisted with the rich underground culture that preceded the rebellion and had formal and informal links to the broader movement. Amid the clandestine development of the commune's defensive and offensive capabilities, the rebels negotiated the proper role of violence just as they did in movements beyond the walls. Ultimately, an assessment of material and environmental conditions caused the rebels to stand down, a decision that was lauded by some and criticized by others. Attica was a space-time of war strategy and tactics, a militant creativity and innovation, a rational planning and conspiration, but war was only the hard outer layer erected to protect something much more sacred. The commune was also a space time of ecstasy, joy, love, intimacy, pleasure, and collective Black radical becoming. It is to these under theorized aspects of its intimate social life that I now turn. This next section is called To Love Each Other in Humanhood. Grab some water. To love each other in humanhood. We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. These words were passionately orated by L.D. Barkley during a press conference held in D-Yard on the first night of the rebellion. By asserting their masculine humanity in radical defiance of institutionalized dehumanization, the Attica rebels extended a long tradition of Black radical and revolutionary discourse in which figures like David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Marcus Garvey, Claude McKay, and Malcolm X fundamentally linked the attainment of Black liberation to the realization of Black manhood. The politics implicit in this form of rhetoric have been roundly criticized for their alleged neglect and or hostility toward feminist and queer approaches to liberation, their ostensible endorsement of Black patriarchy, and for enacting an assumptive logic that necessarily disqualifies dehumanized, dominated, and or feminized subjects from manhood and radicalism. It is certainly true that the Long Attica Revolt emerged out of a social context in which the very real problems of sexism, homophobia, and misogyny undermined the integrity and dynamicism of movements. However, if we understand that Black manhood has never been a stable phenomenon, and that per Sylvia Wynter, white Western bourgeois man overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself, then we must ask, what kind of men were the Attica rebels proclaiming themselves to be? Following the IBW, who wrote the men of Attica were different from their captors. I contend that through their praxis of communing, the rebels enacted forms of gendered life that productively disrupted normative concepts of manhood. They elaborated improvision. Oh Lord, have mercy. They elaborated improvisional. Oh, boom, improvisional and provisional forms of intimate sociality, subjectivity, and human being that fundamentally challenged the foundations of capitalism, patriarchy, and racial colonial world order. It is important to note that Attica's captives experienced the normally functioning prison as an apparatus of abjection, anti-Blackness, and gendered dehumanization. Two descriptions of what reformulating phenon we might call the psychopathologies of the carceral regime provide the existential ground against which the radically new modes of social being were fashioned in the commune. In a 1972 interview for the Attica Defense Committee, Big Black described the prison as an engine of alienation that liberates the capacity for independent thought and action. You no longer think or act or have the right as a human being to express your political beliefs, to be able to talk about and to do things which is in yourself to do. In a letter to his mother, L.D. Barkley narrated his own slow death. I'm dying here, little by little, every day, Mom. You can't imagine what it's like here. In the following chapter, I argue that carceral death machines like Attica are animated by an aspirational logic of white patriarchal mastery, fostered via disavowed practices of ritual violence that are highly sexualized and fundamentally anti-Black. For now, I cite these narrations of Attica's necropolitical effects in order to juxtapose them with what was said and done in the commune, thereby revealing the magnitude of the transformations the rebellions engendered. Accounts from surviving Attica brothers include detailed narrations of the political debates and events that occurred in the yard, but also lavish narrations of what it felt like to be in an Attica's abolition geography. In an interview for the Eyes on the Prize documentary series, Big Black beautifully articulates his exuberant experience. Grab some water. The feeling is hard to describe, but it's a feeling of like being born again, where you didn't have to worry about who you were or what color you were or where you were at, even being in prison, I didn't feel it then. I didn't even feel like I was in Attica State Prison just to view what was happening in that yard. It's like freedom. It was a form of freedom. I didn't have, that keeper up on top of me. And I felt like whatever I was feeling, whatever I was thinking was running together. My emotions was into my thoughts and my feelings. And I had all of that together. And I used that emotion when I was in the yard to solidify my thoughts and my feelings, and that I was thinking what I was feeling. And everybody else was in that kind of vehicle, the way I felt. I felt good, I felt relieved. I felt, I guess, liberated. So that's Big Black describing how he felt once the Black commune was erected and basically they had took over the prison. He said he felt free. He felt liberated. Damn, I want all of us to feel that in our lifetime for real. By destroying existing relations of psychological, social, and spatial domination, the rebellion unlocked new channels of inner mutation, metamorphosis, and self-actualization. It not only birthed an incipient abolition geography, but new subjects who elaborated themselves as they inhabited, explored, and enjoyed their illegal freedom. Endeavoring to describe his inscrutable transformation, Big Black narrates the convergence of his thoughts and feelings with those of others and with the geography in forming a collective consciousness, such that the brothers were no longer frozen in carceral space. Instead, they inhabited a vehicle, a convenience of collective transport to a liberated lifeway, the location of which was entirely uncharted. Big Black's narration is suggestive of Neil Roberts' contention that freedom is best conceptualized as an ongoing process of maroonage, rather than the static antithesis of unfreedom. His concept of sociogenic maroonage, a non-sovereign state of being whose conception of freedom is shaped by cognition, metaphysics, egalitarianism, hope for refuge, and the experiences of masses in a social and political order, is useful for understanding how the Attica rebels engaged in flight while remaining fixed to a cartographic space. By collectively liberating themselves from a domestic war zone and employing collective praxis to create an abolition geography, They constructed an illicit freedom that was more total than that which liberalism allowed, even in the so called quote unquote free world, not only because theirs was not premised on capital, property, and slavery, but also because they fashioned it on their own. This profound experience of liberation and movement while remaining in place was tied to practices of celestial observation and cosmic communion. Like abolitionist Harriet Tubman, who famously used the North Star to usher enslaved Africans to freedom, the Attica rebels were stargazers. As they lived in rebellion, they stole time to contemplate the immensity of the universe and to become intimate with the immensity. As Sacagawea recalls, what stunned me most was this one elderly brother who was looking up at the glimmer of silver stars and was sobbing uncontrollably. I asked him, "What's wrong, brother?" He replied, "I'm so happy. This is the first time I have seen the stars in 23 years." At that point, I understood freedom as more than just free will, unobstructed by any external factors, but also an emotional, sensory, symbiotic relationship between woman and the universe, man or woman in the universe. It was simply gratitude, humble submission to the natural laws of creation, and the sense of elation of feeling that connection. Hmm. Dominant characterizations of the rebellion as a purely rational interaction between an aggrieved group and a repressive agents of the state violently truncate the exuberant and transcendental modes of consciousness, curiosity, and becoming that were nurtured through rebellion. In moments such as these, this consciousness was not preoccupied with the state or even with politics traditionally construed, but rather with the profound desire for genuine connection to other people, the natural environment, and the cosmos. In this account of the rebellion, Richard X. Clarke brings to the surface the gendered practices of intimacy and Black masculine care work that have remained largely submerged in discussions of Attica. Although the text is rife with homophobic and misogynistic language, it describes the erotic life of the commune in ways that suggest the rebels' practices of doing gendered outpace their often deeply problematic rhetoric. For example, in one passage, Clarke describes what it was like to walk through the yard on the first night of the rebellion. "So we walked around, talking softly, just rapping. It was the first time we'd ever seen one another at night. We just walked through the yard checking. We went through each group, me and Shakani and a brother named Amel, who had one arm and walked with a cane, and whom I knew from Auburn. He was a 5%er with a beautiful understanding. There were many other brothers walking around that night in twos and threes, just strolling like a picnic or a carnival, just relaxing. We talked on memories of good times, of bad times. We got a lot of gossip. We drank some pineapple juice and orange juice and smoked without worrying and checked on the hostages and talked and tucked some brothers in for the night." Clarke's account is Clarke's account is of Audre Lorde's notion of the erotic, writing as a Black lesbian feminist who had been marginalized in phallocentric and heteronormative movement spaces. Lorde, who also theorized Black life as warfare, offered the erotic as a resource from which women could realize their deepest desire and build bridges of mutual understanding across difference. She saw the erotic as a non rational form of knowledge in which intellect, emotion, and spirituality became indivisible, creating an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. At first glance, this Black feminist idea may seem ill suited for the context of the Attica Rebellion, but for those who were there, particularly on the first and second nights, the yard was a sanctuary, a picnic, a carnival, a space time of relaxation, creativity, care, and indeed the erotic. The Attica commune embraced homosocial and homosexual intimacy. We can read the ambiguous last line of Clarke's statement. we tucked some brothers in for the night. In a number of ways. Literally, we might surmise that after their long walks, he and the brothers made sure their comrades were comfortable and cozy, pulling their sheets above their shoulders and wishing them a good night. Or perhaps they tucked themselves in together and formed a deeper physical connection. At the very least, the statement articulates a sense of compassion and care that upends normative conceptions of Black revolutionary masculinity within and beyond the prison. The McKay Commission claimed that once the rebels got organized, homosexual relations were outlawed, but the brothers themselves say otherwise. Clark recalls that in response to the homos, in quotes, who were initially going crazy under blankets and in corners throughout the yard, he made an announcement that there was a time and a place for everything, but that this was neither the time nor the place. His announcement was not a prohibition of homosexuality, but rather a call for the collective self discipline necessary to overcome the challenges that lie ahead. Following the path breaking work of Kathy Cohen, I argue that Attica reflected the radical potential of queer politics that encourages the fluidity and movement of people's sexual lives. According to Bugs, D Yard included an authorized place for sexual activity. He explained how, as they remade the yard, Attica's gender rebels appropriated a structure normally used for the guards for surveillance, covered it with white sheets, screwed a red light bulb into the socket, and began calling it the red light district. As he tells it, the quote unquote homos were taking care of business, engaging in wild sex, fucking and sucking dicks all night. The revolt entailed a praxis of sensuous, erotic, carnal activities through which rebels unleashed their most radical imaginations while exploring their suppressed desires and capacities. For some, this meant exploring each other sexually. For others, it meant taking long walks, telling stories, or singing the Delphonics over open fires. Brothers were embracing all the time, Clark wrote, recalling that he witnessed someone spontaneously break into tears because he could not remember ever being so close to other people. The plurality of the revolt crossed lines of race, gender, politics, and ability. Amel, the brother who, according to Clark, had one arm, actually he had a medical condition called spastic monoplegia. I know I butchered all that. And also participated in the Auburn Rebellion and later joined a BLA unit involved in multiple bank expropriations. After Times Square fell to the rebels, 65 captives were released from Attica's E Block, a small building near the prison hospital that housed people with medically diagnosed intellectual and physical disabilities. Clark's manuscript notes that present in the yard were several elders and people with heart conditions, rheumatism, asthma, diabetes, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, and wooden legs. He claims they wanted to be present in DR to experience the commune, noting they were placed near an exit so they could leave at will. However, the killing of Michael Prevotera suggests the profound limitations of the rebels' capacity to create space for expressions of intense cognitive diversity. Let me grab some water. Perceptive outsiders noticed the rebels transforming themselves into new collective subjects. When he first met Blyden in the commune, observer Tom Wicker asked for his full name, to which Blyden responded, "I am Attica." Wicker later noted the strange way in which the rebels were dressed. They donned football helmets, fashioned their blankets into ponchos, and had obscured their faces with sheets and scarves. Subsequent analysts have read the refusal of many of the rebels to divulge their names and reveal their faces as a rational effort to conceal their identities from the state. Their desire to avoid being singled out for retaliation certainly played a role. At the same time, Wicker wondered if these flourishes might be more costume than necessity. Black intellectuals at the IBW leaned into this possibility, writing that the rebels fashioned new garments to symbolize their new identities. In my reading, We Are Men was a capacious declaration of gendered human being articulated by imperfect people who had access to an imperfect language. It is likely that all of the rebels did not identify as men, yet the manhood that they proclaimed and enacted subverted norms of masculinity rooted in white bourgeois ideology and colonial patriarchy. We can only speculate about how these subjectivities and discourses might have evolved if allowed to continue flourishing. However, we know that for some of the rebels, they continued to do just that. By late 1974, Jomo Amawale began to move away from liberated manhood as a rhetorical model. The year he signed off from one of the letters with the salutation to love each other in humanhood. Let me see how much is left in this chapter real quick. Hold on. So that's the end of that section. Next section is abolitionist internationalism. And okay, it's not that long. So this is the last section in this chapter. So abolitionist internationalism. Across the trials, public forums, and journalistic, documentary, and historiographic accounts that trace the rebellion and the massacre, the Attica demand for speedy and safe transportation out of confinement to a non-imperialistic country has been generally ignored or brushed off as an immature exercise of revolutionary fantasy. There are several reasons for this. First, the demand was never realized, a fact that has facilitated its relegation to the margins of Attica politics. Second, three of the outside observers whose subsequent writings and regulations have shaped the dominant conception of the rebellion interpreted the demands as unserious, unrealistic, and relatively unimportant in comparison to the other demands. Third, transportation was not a hegemonic demand. According to the radical lawyer William Kunstler, one of the Attica observers who did support the demand, commitment to it among the rebels never exceeded a couple hundred men out of nearly 1,300. Fourth, the demand was totally ignored by state actors and did not at all figure into the formal negotiations between the rebels and the state for the release of the hostages. Finally, pursuing the implications of the demand's articulation and the networks that supported it unsettles the historical domestication of the rebellion. And I love how he breaks it down in that way, that many things can be true at once, and we should consider all of these things as happening simultaneously. And most importantly, because then you arrive, like he says, that the state did this to domesticate the ongoing rebellion of oppressed people here in this white settler colony. However, once we understand that this demand was an internal demand, that those articulating it were not appealing to the imperialist state, but to the anti-imperialist Black underground, it becomes legible as a logical and even plausible call for militant audacity. Clark recalls that some of the brothers who were more politically aware were very strong on the expropriation of demand. On September 11, 1971, the Commune voted against including it in their formal list of demands, but agreed to allow those who supported it to continue pursuing the possibility informally. We took the position that if they were really interested, they could be in charge of it and they could do their own thing, Clark wrote. Thinking critically about the expatriation demand again allows us to see the political multiplicity and the democratic structure of the revolt at work. While some may have been against internationalism as a concept, it is likely that others withheld support for the demand on tactical rather than ideological grounds. By contrast, people like Akil al-Jundi saw internationalism as critical. A Tombs and Attica rebel, al-Jundi framed the transportation demand as a way to connect the struggle of incarcerated and internally colonized subjects in the United States with anti-colonial rebels in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, those who oppose the rule of colonialism and daily resist Portugal's endeavor to prevent them from gaining national liberation and determining their own course in life. Arguing that global anti-colonial struggles were naturally aligned with those of imprisoned radicals in the United States. We're fighting empire from within. Al-Jundi wrote, when they take a stand against imperialism, they're taking a stand for the benefit of prisoners. His conception of domestic prisons as central to global empire embeds the revolt within broader traditions of anti colonial nationalism that, as Adam Getchachu explains, I know I butchered that name, fought against hierarchical social orders within and between nations. The abolitionist internationalism inherent in the expatriation demand was part of a deeper current running through Black revolutionary politics within and beyond U.S. prisons. Building on a strategy established by the Civil Rights Congress 2 decades earlier, the New York City jail rebels had discussed taking their grievances before the United Nations. At the same time, organizers of the California Prison unionization movement were petitioning prisocrats to apply the Geneva Convention to U.S. political prisoners and to allow those on death row to apply for asylum in communist regimes. As the Auburn Rebellion was unfolding, prisocrats in Elmira, a prison near New York's border with Pennsylvania, intercepted a letter addressed to the United Nations in which captives sought repatriation to Angola in order to fight in their war of liberation against the Portuguese. Ain't that some fuck, man? That's some so fucking dope. Other strands of rebel internationalism were inspired not by hegemonic post war institutions like the United Nations, but by criminalized forms of transnational fugitivity. And it's really important that he highlights the internationalism part of how there were some within the uprising asking to be repatriated to Angola to help in that fight and that struggle, because you have this emergence and this ever growing tightening of fascism in America, in which now you have people of the oppressed class mimicking white talking points such as we need to be isolationists, America first. You know, I can't worry about other people's struggle. I can only worry about my own. And how in cutting off ourselves in that way actually goes in line with what the state wants. And that it also helps to maintain empire, because you cannot sustain a revolution until you connect it to its broader struggle, which internationalism is key. And and again, we're going to start hearing more and more people talking this very America exceptionalist, isolationist tone, and that's by design. But it's interesting that in part of getting their freedom and liberation, the captives knew that internationalism was key. Although state actors and liberal observers did not take the demand seriously, organizers within the BPP and BLA did. Much has been written about the BPP co founder Bobby Seale's brief and underwhelming appearance in D Yard as an Attica observer. However, representatives of the Oakland based BPP Central Committee were not the only Panthers involved in Attica. When Attica erupted, New York's BPP chapter continued to have an above ground footprint, even though state repression and FBI facilitated internecine warfare had forced many of the key figures underground. A 21-year-old Panther named Bernice Jones, who would later change her name to Sophia Bukhari, was one of the major figures overseeing these above ground operations, as well as serving as a link between above ground and underground activities. As repression led to increased political imprisonment, Bukhari hurled herself deeper into prison support work. Even before Attica, she had been writing to and visiting the Auburn rebels and had helped Ricardo de Leon and Cato Dunn establish a BPP chapter in Clinton. Upon hearing the Attica demand for transportation, she immediately contacted foreign governments with whom the Panthers in Algeria had developed ties. The precise details of what happened next are unclear. Bukhari claims to have personally secured verbal agreements from government officials willing to harbor the rebels in Cuba, North Vietnam, and North Korea, while Panther 21 member Afeni Shakur listed North Vietnam, North Korea, Algeria, and Congo Brazzaville. Informed through some combination of underground networks, rumor, and imagination, Dr. Julia and others believed that as many as 17 countries had agreed to accept them. At least one contingent of NYBPP BLA soldiers traveled to Western New York to coordinate the expropriation demand. In New York Times op-ed, Afeni Shakur claimed to have arrived on the evening of September 11th, only to be prevented from entering by roadblocks where heavily armed state agents threatened them with assassination. She further claimed that earlier that morning, Dr. Curtis Powell, another acquitted member of the 21, had slipped through the roadblocks and unsuccessfully attempted to enter DR to communicate directly with the rebels. FBI surveillance, meanwhile, claimed that the Panthers' plan was to hold a press conference outside the prison during which they would contact the rapist Eldridge Cleaver by phone. Cleaver was then expected to publicly announce the Algerian government's approval of the rebels' asylum. In his testimony before Congress, Panther lawyer and Attica observer William Kunstler claimed that on Sunday, September 12th, he met with Dr. Powell, Kawando Kinsasa, and Lumumba Shakur, and another New York Panther that he did not name, but who was likely Afeni Shakur. Although I have found no evidence to support her claim, Afeni wrote in the Times that at the command of the inmates, a jet would land at Kennedy Airport to safely transport those inmates to a non-imperialist country. Later that day, during his last trip to DR, Kunstler was alluding to those BPP and BLA soldiers when he announced that there are 4 third world country people across the street from the prison prepared to provide asylum for everyone that wants to leave this country from this prison. A claim that vexed the observers who were trying to convince the rebels to surrender and accept the reform proposals they had drafted with prisocrats. Additional support for the expatriation demand came from unexpected places. In a bizarre twist, members of the Jewish Defense League wrote letters to Governor Rockefeller and staged sit-in protests in front of his office and that of Democratic presidential candidates demanding the authorization of their proposal to exchange Attica rebels with Jews imprisoned in the Soviet Union. The far-right Zionist organization claimed to have communicated with Herbert X. Blyden, obtaining his agreement to be exchanged for Silva Zalmanson, who had been confined in a Moldavian gulag since 1970. Little else is known about the plan and whether the Soviets were even aware of its existence. While the Soviet Union could hardly be characterized as a non-imperialist regime, a decade and a half after the atrocities of Stalinism were exposed, perhaps Blyden believed that his chances of survival were greater behind the Iron Curtain than they were beneath the stars and stripes. There is no evidence of any movement on this plan, but the point stands that many people at the time, both inside and outside the prison, took the expropriation demands seriously. The internationalism of the revolt was articulated in other ways. Prior to, during, and after the rebellion, the rebels forged symbolic and material ties with anti-colonial movements, especially those in Southeast Asia and Cuba. It is well known that the Attica Liberation Faction's manifestos of demands and anti-oppression platform was adapted from a similar set of demands constructed as part of the Folsom prison strike in California. It is less well known, however, that at some point after the faction submitted these demands to New York's prisocrats, the document was translated into the Vietnamese language and issued to the authorities in Tan Hype, Tudak, and Con Son Island national prisons in South Vietnam, where CIA-sponsored technical advisors, in quotes, from the U.S. were aiding the pacification effort through carceral strategies developed at home. So basically, what I just read is that the work that was done by the captives in revolt in Attica got changed to rewritten in Vietnamese to help the captives that were also fighting imperialism in Vietnam. That's some dope ass shit. And more importantly, they were fighting the pacification. So that is the workings of what prison's supposed to do. Those that are unruly, those who are not law abiding, quote unquote, they get put there to be pacified, to get the unruly elements out of the mass populace so that you can continue to control the mass populace. And that pacification strategy was being used in Vietnam too. So Attica, seeing the international responsibility, is to give what they learned and to pass it on. And it actually was passed on. That's really interesting to me. Following the massacre, the Union of North American Residents and Expat Community for Black Americans in Cuba wrote open letters of solidarity to the surviving Attica rebels. Your conduct, discipline, and courage and unswerving determination to carry your actions to their logical conclusion is admired as an example to all who struggle for justice and respect as human beings. The UN forwarded a message of solidarity from a Vietnamese contingent in Cuba. We are indignant about the brutal prison system in the United States, which we have heard and read about. George Jackson's letters from prison have deeply moved our youth. Angela's example is brilliant. We know that there are thousands of American revolutionaries in U.S. prisons, and although we cannot express our support for them because of the U.S. new blockade, our hearts are always with them. Our victory in Vietnam is also your victory. Powerful shit. Third world movements recognize the prison movement as a legitimate revolutionary struggle. Communicating through the National Lawyers Guild, Attica rebels responded, "You and all those who have taken an active stand against fascism, imperialism, racism, and injustice have been our impetus as you've made the concept of liberation a reality. The people in Cuba, North Vietnam, North Korea, the People's Republic of China, the Palestinians, the Mozambicans, Angolans, and those from Guinea-Bissau are our paragons." Sorry. These expressions of transnational affinity, solidarity, and common interest did not evolve into a coalition capable of attacking U.S. empire from within and beyond its borders, nor did the aircraft that many hoped would arrive to whisk the rebels to a locale beyond the reach of empire ever materialize. Yet, the mere existence of these revolutionary demands, aspirations, and conspiratorial plans unsettles the rights-based framework that has dominated the narration of Attica for the past 50 years. The failure to document and theorize this internationalism has facilitated the rebellion's domestication, shifting it from a repudiation of the US empire to a palatable cry for better treatment within its dungeons. Ooh, that was a whole fucking word, okay? For those on the cutting edge of the prison movement, prisons were zones of combat within a historically protracted, geographically diffuse arena of revolt against patriarchal, white supremacy, capitalism, and globalized empire. I have labored to decarcerate the revolutionary meaning and significance of Attica. Its maximum demands are not to be found in the formal negotiations between captives and the state for improvements to prison conditions, but in the living theories and practices of revolt itself, in modes of militant self defense, sabotage, and counter violence, in methods of autonomous self governance, above ground and underground organizations and world making, in practice of narrative, archival, and epistemic insurgents, in internationalist politics and radical anti racism, and in new forms of gendered life, social consciousness, and human being to which the revolt gave rise. The self activity of revolt's intellectuals, engineers, organizers, and participants marked the disintegration of authoritarian rule and the production of an illegal freedom. They liberated themselves from an acute zone of war and for a time lived in the world of their own making. This world was provisional, incomplete, and imperfect, and yet was rooted in radical principles of justice, equality, and mutuality that were more capacious than those of the world beyond the walls. For this reason, the rebellion was interrupted by many not, or I'm sorry, interpreted by many not as temporary rupture of racial colonial power, but as a revolution, an abolition, a decolonization, a proper condition of existence. More than 50 years later, Attica remains a living example that collectively, ordinary people can be more than a sum of their parts. And that's the end of chapter 3 and the end of part 1. And part 2, it starts off called Prison Pacification. And I think y'all are going to love part 2 of this book because he goes the fuck in. But yeah, so I'm going to try to read a chapter a space, which makes the space a little longer. But hopefully for people listening to a recording, it still can serve as a resource. You can just play it and get all this information and listen to me stumble and bungle on words. But hopefully get the gist of the message. So I hope everyone listening take care. And above all, let's get free.